For years, Ethiopia and the United States have been partners, critics, and sometimes something in between. But this week, something changed. On August 19th and 20th, 2026, Ethiopia sent a high-level defense delegation to Washington. And inside the Pentagon, Ethiopian and American officials agreed to take their military and diplomatic relationship into what they described as a new and advanced chapter. That might sound like another diplomatic meeting. It isn't. Because Ethiopia sits at the center of a region where the Red Sea, global trade, military power, and African geopolitics are colliding. Sudan is at war. Somalia is strategically contested. Egypt and Ethiopia remain locked in disputes over the Nile. China has established a military presence nearby. Turkey and the Gulf states are expanding their influence. And Ethiopia itself is trying to solve one of its biggest strategic vulnerabilities. It has no coastline. So why is Washington suddenly looking to deepen its defense relationship with Addis Ababa? What does Ethiopia want from America? And could this meeting mark the beginning of a new security architecture in the Horn of Africa? The meeting was led on the Ethiopian side by Major General Teshome Gemechu, Director General of Foreign Relations and Military Cooperation at Ethiopia's Ministry of Defense. Representing the American side was Brian J. Ellis, Deputy Assistant Secretary of War for African Affairs. The two sides held bilateral consultations at the Pentagon. But the most important part wasn't simply who attended, it was what they agreed to do next. According to Ethiopia's Ministry of Defense, the two sides agreed to expand institutional cooperation and strengthen strategic coordination. Their proposed framework focuses on several pillars: protecting national interests, creating mutual benefits, building lasting cooperation through greater trust, and strengthening joint efforts for peace, security, and stability in the Horn of Africa and the wider region. And both sides said they wanted to move quickly to implement those frameworks. That creates an important distinction. This announcement does not establish a formal military alliance. There is no publicly announced mutual defense treaty. There is no announced American security guarantee for Ethiopia. Instead, what we are seeing is potentially more gradual, and perhaps more strategically important. A deliberate attempt to rebuild the relationship. To understand why the reset matters, we need to remember where this relationship came from. For decades, Ethiopia was one of Washington's most important security partners in Africa. The two countries cooperated on counterterrorism, regional security, diplomacy, and more. But that partnership suffered major damage during Ethiopia's internal conflicts. Washington became increasingly critical of the Ethiopian government's conduct. Addis Ababa, meanwhile, became increasingly suspicious of Western pressure. Trust declined, and once trust disappears between two governments, rebuilding it can take years. But strategic realities have changed. The Horn of Africa has become more important, not less. The Red Sea has become a major security flashpoint. Sudan has collapsed into devastating conflict. Somalia remains central to counterterrorism and maritime security. And competition among outside powers has accelerated. Which brings us to the most important fact on the map. Ethiopia is enormous, and it sits directly behind the Red Sea. Ethiopia is one of Africa's most populous and strategically important countries. But there is a fundamental problem. It is landlocked. Its international trade depends heavily on neighboring countries and access corridors. For Ethiopia, this isn't simply an economic inconvenience. It is a strategic vulnerability, because ports are power. A country that controls or reliably accesses a major port can influence trade, logistics, energy flows, and regional commerce. And Ethiopia wants greater control over its maritime future. This is why the Red Sea matters so much to Addis Ababa. But there is a catch. The moment Ethiopia seeks greater maritime access, the issue becomes regional. Somalia cares, Djibouti cares, Eritrea cares, Egypt cares, the Gulf states care, and increasingly, Washington cares. Look at the Red Sea today. It is surrounded by strategic competition. Djibouti hosts military facilities connected to multiple global powers. China established its first overseas military base there. The United States operates a major military installation in the country. France, Japan, and other powers have also maintained military footprints. Across the water, Saudi Arabia has enormous economic and security interests. Yemen sits at the southern gateway. Eritrea controls a strategically important coastline, and Somalia has one of the longest coastlines in Africa. Then there is Ethiopia, a giant country without a coastline, sitting immediately behind this entire system. That makes Ethiopia unusual. It doesn't control the Red Sea, but its political and economic future is deeply connected to it. And this is where the US-Ethiopia relationship becomes much more interesting. America already has a major strategic presence in the region, but Washington faces a changing environment. China is expanding its influence. Turkey has developed deep defense and diplomatic ties with Somalia. The Gulf states have invested heavily in ports, logistics, and infrastructure. European countries remain active. Russia is seeking opportunities to expand its influence, and regional states are becoming increasingly assertive. For Washington, the question is no longer simply, who is our partner? It is, how do we maintain influence in a region where everyone is competing? Ethiopia offers something few other countries can: scale, population, military weight, geographic depth, and influence across the Horn. If America wants a long-term regional strategy, Addis Ababa is difficult to ignore. But what does Ethiopia want? The relationship is not simply America approaching Ethiopia. Ethiopia has its own strategic calculation, and Addis Ababa has been trying to diversify its partnerships: China, Turkey, the Gulf, Europe, Russia, the United States. Each offers different opportunities. Ethiopia does not necessarily need to choose one. It can attempt to work with all of them. That strategy gives Addis Ababa something extremely valuable: strategic flexibility. A stronger relationship with Washington could provide access to American defense institutions, diplomatic channels, and potentially greater cooperation in security matters. But Ethiopia can simultaneously maintain relationships with other powers. That is the logic of a multi-aligned foreign policy, and it may be exactly what Addis Ababa is pursuing. But there is a problem. The stronger Ethiopia becomes strategically, the more complicated America's balancing act becomes. Ethiopia's biggest strategic questions are connected to countries that Washington already works with: Somalia, Egypt, Djibouti, and potentially Eritrea. Washington therefore cannot look at Ethiopia in isolation. Every Ethiopian strategic move has regional consequences, and that is where this new defense relationship could become difficult. America may want Ethiopia to become a stronger security partner, but it also wants stability among Ethiopia's neighbors. Those two objectives can sometimes collide. Consider Somalia. The United States has invested heavily in Somalia's security and counter-terrorism efforts. Turkey, too, has developed a major defense relationship with Mogadishu. Somalia's importance is rising, not just for its own future, but because of its strategic coastline and proximity to vital maritime routes. At the same time, Ethiopia stands as one of the region's most significant security actors. Yet, Ethiopia's pursuit of maritime access has become a sensitive and complex issue. Somalia insists on its sovereignty and territorial integrity. This dynamic means Washington could soon face a delicate balancing act. How do you deepen cooperation with Ethiopia while maintaining strong relations with Somalia? That question may become one of the defining tests of America's new approach in the Horn of Africa. Then there is Egypt. The Nile has been at the center of one of Africa's most consequential geopolitical disputes. Ethiopia sees development of its water resources as essential to national development. Egypt views the Nile as a fundamental national security interest. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam has therefore become much more than an infrastructure project. It is a symbol of competing national interests. Now add the Red Sea. Egypt controls the Suez Canal. Ethiopia wants greater maritime access. Both countries are increasing their engagement across the Horn, and America has strategic relationships with both. That means Washington has to walk a very narrow line. A stronger US-Ethiopian relationship does not automatically mean an anti-Egypt strategy. But Cairo will certainly pay attention to how far the partnership goes. And behind all of this is another giant, China. China's presence in Africa is no longer just about trade. Its economic relationships have expanded across infrastructure, telecommunications, energy, and logistics. And in Djibouti, China operates its first overseas military base. For Washington, that changes the strategic equation. The Horn of Africa is no longer simply an arena for regional competition. It is increasingly part of global competition. America does not want to lose strategic influence. China does not want to lose its position. Gulf powers are building their own networks. Turkey is expanding its presence, and African states are increasingly learning how to negotiate between them. Ethiopia is one of the most important examples of this new diplomatic environment. This is not about Ethiopia choosing America. There is a temptation to describe it that way. But that would be too simple. Ethiopia is unlikely to abandon its broader network of relationships, and the United States is unlikely to demand that it does. Instead, think of this as a competition for strategic access. Washington wants stronger engagement. Ethiopia wants more options. China wants to maintain its influence. Turkey wants to expand its regional role. The Gulf states want secure trade and investment routes. And everyone is watching the Red Sea. This is not a traditional Cold War where countries simply choose one side. It is something more complicated. A multipolar competition where African states increasingly have the ability to bargain with everyone. Chapter 4. What could actually change? If the frameworks announced in Washington are implemented, several areas could potentially deepen. Institutional engagement, military-to-military communication, professional exchanges, strategic dialogue, regional security coordination, and potentially broader defense cooperation. But it is important to separate what has actually been announced from what remains possible. The August 2026 discussions do not publicly establish a detailed American weapons package or a mutual defense commitment. So the real story is not a sudden military transformation. It is the creation of a framework. And frameworks matter, because once institutions begin communicating regularly, relationships can evolve much faster. Today's consultation can become tomorrow's strategic dialogue, and tomorrow's dialogue can eventually become long-term cooperation. So what happens next? There are three broad possibilities. Future 1. The strategic reset succeeds. The two governments implement the frameworks quickly. Defense institutions build deeper relationships. Strategic coordination expands. And Ethiopia becomes a much more important US security partner. If that happens, Washington's influence in the Horn could increase significantly. Future 2. Cooperation without alignment. This may be the most likely. Ethiopia and America deepen defense ties, but Ethiopia continues working with China, Turkey, the Gulf states, and Europe. Washington becomes one of Addis Ababa's major strategic partners, not its only one. Future 3. Regional tensions limit the partnership. This is where things become complicated. If Ethiopia's relations with Somalia deteriorate, if tensions with Egypt intensify, if Red Sea competition becomes more militarized, America could find itself balancing several conflicting interests, and the deeper Washington becomes involved, the harder that balancing act becomes. But perhaps the biggest lesson is not about America, it is about Africa. Across the continent, governments are becoming more strategic about foreign partnerships. They are no longer necessarily asking, who is our ally? They are asking, what can each partner offer us? Investment from China, defense cooperation from Turkey, capital from the Gulf, technology and security cooperation from America, trade and investment from Europe. This is a new era of African diplomacy, and Ethiopia is one of the countries best positioned to take advantage of it, because Addis Ababa has something every major power wants: geographic importance. So let's return to the original question. Why does this Pentagon meeting matter? Because Ethiopia is not just another country seeking defense cooperation. It is a major power sitting at the center of an increasingly contested region. And America is not just another foreign partner. It is one of the world's most powerful military and diplomatic actors. Put the two together, and the consequences can extend far beyond bilateral relations. A stronger partnership could help Ethiopia strengthen its strategic position. It could give Washington greater influence in the Horn. It could affect how regional states calculate their own partnerships. And it could change the balance of power around the Red Sea. But there is another possibility. The closer America gets to Ethiopia, the more deeply it may become involved in Ethiopia's regional disputes. And that is the paradox. The partnership could create stability, or it could expose Washington to new strategic risks. The August 2026 Pentagon meeting does not create a new alliance overnight, but it does something potentially more important. It changes the direction of the relationship. After years of tension and uncertainty, Washington and Addis Ababa are talking about rebuilding trust, expanding institutional cooperation, strengthening strategic coordination, and working together on the security of the Horn of Africa. The next step will determine whether this becomes a genuine strategic reset, or simply another diplomatic moment. Because the Horn of Africa is changing, the Red Sea is changing, Africa's relationships with global powers are changing, and Ethiopia is trying to position itself at the center of that transformation. So watch what happens next. Watch Washington, watch Addis Ababa, watch Somalia, watch Egypt, and most importantly, watch the Red Sea. Because if Ethiopia and the United States truly become strategic partners again, the consequences won't stop at the Pentagon. They could reach across the entire Horn of Africa, and perhaps change the balance of power in one of the world's most important regions. Subscribe for deeper stories on Africa's geopolitics, infrastructure, resources, and the global powers reshaping the continent.